You can store you in a jar and no one will get killed. All right, everyone. Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Screenplay Archaeology podcast. I'm your host, KiramidHead, and today I'm bringing you a solo episode. And I know I said a few episodes back that I maybe wouldn't be able to do a solo episode for August because I was busy working on a couple other things, and I would just do the two-man episode I had planned, but that one's kind of falling by the wayside because Deus Deacon had some stuff he has to do, so he's not going to be available for a while. So it's just going to be me this time. I don't know how I'm going to fill a second episode for this month. Maybe I'll do another solo. Maybe I'll rope someone in for a really, really quick episode, but who knows? But yeah, so before I get into anything else tonight, I'm going to just do my usual shouts and plugs. Check out the social media links down below, the Facebook, Tumblr, Twitter, Blogger, and whatever else I got linked down below. Also, I've been plugging the Shelf podcast that talks about scripts as well for the last several months. It seems like ever since I started plugging them, that's when they've been having trouble getting new episodes out. So it's almost like I've jinxed them. But they are working on getting new stuff out. They're like rebooting the podcast, as they say it, and they're going to have tried to get new episodes out starting in October. So be on the lookout for that. And so the script I'm going to be covering tonight is the 1992 remake script for The Creature from the Black Lagoon, written by Bill Phillips, and would have been directed by John Carpenter with effects work by Rick Baker. The basic gist of it is it's more or less the same as the original 1954 movie, but it's updated. It's set in the 90s, and so the basic plot is more or less the same. You have a group of scientists visiting the Black Lagoon in the outer reaches of the Amazon, or the inner reaches of the Amazon, as the case may be. It's remote and isolated, and in this version, it's a group of scientists on their research vessel, and there's an environmental activist named Siri who kind of falls in with them, and they find a series of underwater pyramids and temples at the bottom of the lagoon, which they're investigating. And while they're there, they catch the attention of the creature from the Black Lagoon, which is a remnant of whatever once lived in this place. And it forms a bit of a crush upon this activist named Siri, and so that causes complications. And there's also this guy who shows up who has a beef with the creature who survived the previous encounter, so that's an element to the plot that's been added. But that's more or less the basic rundown. Now, to go into the background, the original Creature from the Black Lagoon is in many ways the last great Universal monster movie. And it's interesting that because it comes so late after the previous cycle ended, it's almost sort of an entity unto itself. But it's interesting in how it's sort of like a merger of some of the things that were done in the original sort of cycle of Universal monster movies, as well as being a 50s science fiction monster movie. And it's kind of in between those, because you have like the whole scientific basis of it being more of a science fiction movie, but it also has, the somewhat sympathetic creature. Which was one of those things which the old Universal films, like the Frankenstein monster and the Wolfman, they were very much that. And this is a very good movie. It's got fairly solid acting for a 50s B movie, and it looks really good. Like, the underwater photography is great. It's got a number of really memorable scenes in it, namely the watery ballet scene with the creature following the girl through the water and swimming right underneath her, and she doesn't know he's there. And also a really, really great creature suit, which still holds up today. And I look at it and I'm going like, it's not terribly creaky looking or anything. It still holds up fairly well. Like, yeah, obviously it's a guy in the suit, but it's a really good looking suit. And the eyes on that thing, like, they look like medallions or something. They're really creepy looking, especially when they do close-ups of it just like opening and closing its mouth with those eyes just staring. Some really creepy stuff in that scene towards the beginning of the movie when it kills those two guys in the tent and you don't really see it. That's a well-directed, suspenseful scene. So yeah, it's a very good movie, directed by Jack Arnold, who did a number of well-known 50 science fiction movies like It Came from Outer Space, The Incredible Shrinking Man, which helped because it had Richard Matheson writing it, and also other lesser known stuff like Monster on the Campus, which is silly but fun. The sequel, Revenge of the Creature, it's been a very long time since I've seen that one, a decade or more at this point. And I remember it being a pretty solid sequel. Like, it's one of those ones that people kind of overlook, and I think it gets that treatment because I want to say it was on MST3K, so I think people kind of tend to overlook that one, but it's not as good as the first movie, but I remember it being pretty solid, and the idea of, like, the creature getting captured and taken to Florida, basically getting put in SeaWorld was a pretty neat idea. And, oops, I hit the microphone, sorry about that. I remember it being kind of cool, and the idea that, it breaks out and goes on kind of a rampage was neat. The main thing I remember being an issue, though, was that they changed the suit because the actors in the first movie had issues seeing out of it, so they changed the eyes, and they did it really badly. They turned into these big, round, goofy, googly eyes, which are just bad looking. And so, yeah, that kind of ruins the design, but it was a solid sequel on the whole. The third movie, The Creature Walks Among Us, is interesting, has a number of good ideas. I don't think it coalesces into a particularly good movie at the end of the day. Once again, I haven't seen this one in a very long time. But in that one, it's like the creature who has escaped to the Everglades since the second movie. These people go in to go capture it, and they fuck up so badly they somehow manage to set the thing on fire and burn its gills off, and so its lungs sort of become active, and so it begins, and so but now it can only breathe in through its lungs. It can't go back into the water. It doesn't have the scales anymore, which is a shame because it loses, like, the uniqueness of the original design. But it is an interesting idea, and it does make the creature a more sympathetic character, and really, from what I remember, the creature is the only likable character whatsoever in that movie, because the main guy is an asshole, his wife is annoying, and like, his friend who ends up as, like, her lover is just nothing at all. And it turns into, like, this soap opera plot where, like, he kills the husband kills the lover and, like, tries to blame it on the creature. And so and, like, it was just really stupid. I didn't give two shits about anybody other than the creature in that movie. But it did have some good moments in it, particularly the ending, where the creature is sitting on the beach watching the ocean, wanting to just swim away, but it knows it can't, and so you're left kind of ambiguously wondering whether the thing commits suicide or not. Really interesting, bittersweet way to end a movie, and a series when you think about it. Like, that's kind of daring and interesting. It's just a shame the rest of the movie wasn't up to much. And so the creature, unlike the other Universal monsters, I guess because it was an original concept, it never really got the Hammer remake treatment, because, like, Dracula and Frankenstein are public domain characters, and anybody can make a werewolf. You just can't call it the Wolfman or Larry Talbot without Universal say so. So yeah, so the Gilman kind of went away for a while. Interestingly enough, there was a novelization in the 70s, which sounds completely goddamn insane, where it's like the creature is like twice the size of the boat and has like a tail, like a stinger tail, and then they have to electrocute it to death. Like, I want to read that book just to see if it's as insane as it sounds. But in the early 80s is when the first attempt at a remake happened, where John Landis, who was a big name at the time, this is obviously before the Twilight Zone, the movie incident, more or less killed his career, decided, to put together a Creature from the Black Lagoon remake. They're going to do it in 3D like the original was in 3D, and he wanted Jack Arnold, the original director, to do it. And interesting trivia note, but Jack Arnold was in bad health at the time, and so in case he couldn't do it, Joe Dante was off to the side to take over just in case. So that's interesting. So Joe Dante could have done a Creature from the Black Lagoon remake, and the script would have been written by Nigel Neal, who was, of course, he's still known today for Quatermass, the movies and the serials. And so yeah, he's a strong science fiction writer. He also went uncredited on Halloween 3 for that's a whole storyline for some other time. That script hasn't been out there, but from like various sources, apparently the plot would have been there were two creatures, one good, one evil, and they were both being pursued to be captured by the government. And it almost sounds kind of like War of the Gargantuas, only like the Black Lagoon version. But that'd be interesting to read to see if we can maybe get our hands on it someday. I don't yet. It's an incredibly rare script. That and Halloween 3 are like only like a handful of people have it. So that's something where we're probably never gonna get it, but it would be interesting to showcase on this show. And so and what happened to that version was that Landis was really pushing for it, but he was also pushing for the 3D, which was kind of going through its second craze at the time. Like, the first phase was the 50s, and it came back in the early 80s, but Universal had just put a bunch of money into Jaws 3D, and that didn't pan out. That didn't do very well at the box office, and so Universal kind of backed off of it, and so it didn't happen. And it kind of came and went through the 80s with, like, different directors attached. Like, I think Joe Dante was attached again at some point. But it was one of those things that was always kind of on the back burner until the early 90s when John Carpenter got involved. I'm guessing the reason why The Creature from the Black Lagoon, why they started looking at it for a remake again at that point was... Because I know the reason why they started working on The Mummy was because there were other studios doing Frankenstein and Dracula movies, and people at Universal were like, yeah, let's go do our monsters and do our versions of it. Why would everyone else do it? Which was why they did The Mummy. So I'm guessing this had something to do with it. So yeah, early 90s, 1992 was an interesting time for Carpenter because he had just gotten off of 4 years without a movie after They Live, just a bunch of projects that couldn't get off the ground. There was Shadow Company, which I covered before, Pincushion, which I'll get to down the line. That's one of the big ones that always gets talked about. And then he had just done Memoirs of Invisible Man, which unfortunately was a flop. And I actually just watched that for the first time not long ago, all the way through. I'd seen bits of it before. And it honestly wasn't that bad of a movie. It's not top tier Carpenter by any stretch, but it was a fun little thriller with humorous moments. It was just the more overt comedic bits really didn't work. That's really the only problem. There's like these long gags that just fall kind of flat. And it had kind of wonky pacing and could have had like 10 minutes cut out of the middle of it and would have been better for it. But other than that, it was a pretty solid little effort. But him doing a big studio movie, that kind of got him some clout. So he started talking to Universal, and I think that's how he got this job initially. And so he brought in Bill Phillips. Now, they had worked together before on some stuff. Like, they had first worked together, I think, on Firestarter, which Carpenter was supposed to make. And then that fell apart because The Thing didn't do well, and a bunch of other Stephen King adaptations didn't do well. So they pulled the plug on Carpenter's version because the budget was higher than they wanted to spend. And that script's actually pretty good. That and the Bill Lancaster script that Bill Phillips was rewriting. Those were actually pretty good for what they were, and that would be an interesting episode down the line. But when the plug got pulled on that, they moved over and did Christine, which was a Carpenter film, which the first time I watched it, I wasn't huge on it. It was okay. But when I watched it again, it actually really grew on me. And I think that's one of the better Stephen King movies out there. Like, it's top 15, top 10, maybe. It's a really strong movie. And reading, how Phillips sort of took what the book was and the things he changed for it, it sounds like he just did everything he did was an improvement almost, because I haven't read the book, but just reading about it, it sounds like it condensed things well enough. And it basically it cut down to what the core of the story was and made it about that. Christine's actually a really strong adaptation of a Stephen King story. Really great movie, too, with some great Carpenter style. So, yeah, they worked together. They worked on some other stuff through the 80s, most of which didn't, come to realization. But so that brings us to this script. Now, like I said before, there's two drafts. Like, really, it's just slight revisions of one draft, but one's dated May 4th, 1992, and the other one's dated May 8th. Now, there's not really a huge amount of difference between them. It's mainly some dialogue's different, and there's some added description or some altered descriptions. Like, it's really almost exactly the same. And when Phillips was asked about it, he said he remembered Carpenter doing a quick pass on the script, and I think that's definitely the case because some of the things that are different feel like things Carpenter would add. So, to move on to the script, actually, I'll get to that when I come to it. It's one thing in particular, but to start off with the script, it opens in 1988, and there's a shot of the Earth from space, which I think was going to be a nod to the Universal logo, and it zooms in on the Amazon rainforest, and we see a plane, and there's the pilot, whose name is Richard Conroy, and there's a cartographer named Pete Hazard. They're flying it over the jungle. I guess they're mapping it, and they run into a storm, and they're forced to crash land. And there's a bit here which is there's a bit of silly comedy here where Pete Hazard, who by the way is supposed to be Australian, where he doesn't know what happens. He asks for a life preserver, and Richard's like, don't pull the tab and inflate it until we crash. And so they crash on land and he inflates it. And I'm like, that's a weird bit of comedy to throw in there. And so they find themselves on the shore of the Black Lagoon, which I believe they say is 60 feet by 200 feet. And they're examining the plane's engine, and Richard, he spots the tip of a stone covered in hieroglyphs and vines sticking out of the water. So they inflate a rubber life raft and they paddle on over there. And they notice that it's not that the tip of the stone is not set completely on top of it. And so they can see inside, it's like a lid. And so they push the tip of the stone over, and there's a passageway going down into the water. And so this is the tip of what we find out later on is the pyramid, essentially, the first pyramid. And so they're looking in, and And Richard, he's speculating that it's some sort of temple, and he begins to lower himself into the passage, and he's looking down, and he looks back up and says, hey, I think I saw something, and this massive webbed hand emerges from the depths and then yanks him under. And so Pete is hastily pedaling back to shore, and he jumps in the plane. He's trying to radio for help. And I'm going to have to mention this here because it's kind of inconsistent later, because he knows what the grid reference is. Like, he's trying to give them, like, their coordinates, and then, like, he reacts in horror as the shadow of an unseen creature falls over him. And so that's the opening. Pretty cool idea, pretty strong introduction to the creature. Once again, we don't see it, we just see the hand, because in the original movie, you see the hand come out of the water a couple times, and then it goes and attacks the two guys in the tent, but you don't see it. So that's a cool way to build up to the creature. This is where a difference between the two drafts comes in, is that it cuts to, in the May 4th draft, it cuts to 4 years later in 1992, and it specifies 1992. In the May 8th draft, it cuts to 5 years later and doesn't say a year. Now, both drafts say 1988 for that first scene, so the second draft, or the May 8th draft, would be 1993. And so so it cuts to 4 years later, and there's a research ship called the El Dorado 2 moored in the Black Lagoon. And we see some members of the expedition, including the ichthyologist Abel, the medical doctor Jake, and Jean-Claude, who might be a botanist. They never say for sure, but there's like references to him being really interested in plants, and the May 8th draft references the fact that his fingers are colored chlorophyll green, so I guess that would mean he's a botanist. And Adolfo is watching from the boat, and Adolfo, I think, is meant to be like the captain of the ship. Like, the ship doesn't really have a crew, like, it just has like these scientist guys and Adolfo, who's this hilarious dude who wears a white suit, has gold chains around his neck, and he's always singing opera. Like, he's kind of fun. He's sort of like Lucas from the original movie, only he's not as sarcastic or hilarious as Lucas. Like, if there's one character from the original that I would carry over almost unchanged, it would be Lucas, because that guy's great. Like, he's just hanging around going like, he just has this smirk on his face the whole time, like he's not impressed with the scientists at all. And when like the head of the expedition is like bringing out a big harpoon gun, he's just not impressed. Like, he's just kind of laughing it off. Like, he's such a fun character. But the other three guys, they're in the water. Adolfo's watching from the deck. And so Abel is like, look, he notes that, like, the stone at the top of a pyramid, and they say that it looks Incan, but the Incas, they never made it that far inland, and they talk about that quite a bit. And another one of the changes to the description is that Jake, like, it mentions that he has, like, a really nice sense of fashion they're in like a boat. They're in a raft. They're not in the water, but he has like this really nice sense of fashion. In the May 8th draft, it mentions that he's like a Stuart Granger wannabe, like he's seen too many old jungle movies. And I'm like, yeah, that's kind of a fun reference, because I've seen, the King Solomon's Mines with Stuart Granger, and he did have that sort of those nice white suits in a couple of the early scenes. And so while this is going on, there's two other members. There's Hector, who's a botanist, and Bobby, who I think is meant to be an ornithologist, because it's mentioned later on that he's cataloged all these different kinds of birds. They find the wrecked plane, but there's no bodies inside it, so that sets up something for later. And then we go back to the stone, and Abel and Richard, they discover that Richard? Who the hell is Richard? Wait a minute. I just randomly wrote Richard in the notes instead of Jake. They discover that the tip is a separate piece, and they push it back and discover the inner passage. There, let me fix that. And now Abel is ready to explore, but Jake's like, hey, let's get an actual archaeologist to come on site so they can examine the find properly. And so when they're back on board the ship, Jake, he's using the radio to contact the archaeologists he wants brought in. So he says that it looks like an Inca pyramid, and it looks like it's designed to be underwater. But then it turns out that the two that they want, they're at a conference in Norway, and so they won't be able to get to the lagoon for over a week. And Abel and Hector are like, yeah, like, we don't want to wait that long. We're going to explore this thing as soon as we can. And then here comes a weird scene where, okay, so the crew, they gather and they meet Siri, who's a Greenpeace member who was in Brazil to protest, the raising of the rainforest. And she says she was forced to jump into the river to avoid the authorities. And this is really weird because we never see her get on the boat. Like, it just cuts from them, exploring the whole pyramid thing and talking on the radio about it. Suddenly this person's on the boat and they're like, you've already met Jean-Claude. And I'm like, so I'm thinking like Jean-Claude found her in the water, and I'm like, when did they find her exactly? Did she swim all the way from this town that she fled from to the lagoon? Like, I'm not really sure. Like, it's a really awkward way to introduce the character. I'm not really sure. But like everyone seems fine having her aboard. Ben Abel's just kind of like, he's a little bit disapproving because she apparently was spiking trees, which can fuck people up if they try to chainsaw a tree off a spike in, and it's kind of a dubious thing to do. But he says, hey, he goes to talk to Mary, who's this biologist who rarely leaves her lab. He goes to get her vote, and she says yes, so Abel approves of Siri joining the team. And there's this whole thing we introduced where she's like counting her algae and she's obsessed with her algae, and then Abel purposely throws off her count and fucks it up, which is pretty funny. And so later that night we get Jake 2 times. Jake tries to awkwardly hit on Siri once in her cabin, and Abel like gets him to leave, and he says, welcome to the El Dorado too. Hope you enjoy your stay. And Abel's just like, you sound like a flight attendant. That was a pretty funny line. And then he's like talking to her on deck later. And then you have a scene where Abel, he apologizes for his curt behavior earlier, and there's glimpses of the creature watching her from the water when she goes on deck because she's on deck after being unable to sleep. And like in the May 4th draft, like it specifically describes that we see the creature's eyes. And okay, first off, I think that's a mistake because we see too much too soon. And also, this is the first time we get this thing that we keep reading about throughout the script where it's like, its eyes are surprisingly soft. And I'm like, okay, we get it. The creature has soft eyes. You don't have to bring it up every time the eyes pop in the frame. And also, but then again, that gets fixed. In the May 8th draft, not only are all the references to soft eyes removed, but the glimpses of the creature watching her, it's more of like we just see a vague shape moving in the water, which I like, and POV shots, which are in the earlier draft. And also when Jake's coming on to her on the deck in the May 8th revisions, he's a lot more overt, and he's like, hey, you look like Ava Gardner in Mogambo, and then she's much more forcefully rejects him. And so that's one of the things that has me convinced that this was in fact like a John Carpenter, like a light pass that he did, because Mogambo was a John Ford movie, and of course Carpenter's a big fan of John Ford. If you know anything about Carpenter, you know that he loves Ford and his westerns and all his movies. Like that was one of his big influences. So yeah, that has led me to believe that Bill Phillips was right in his recollection. And so the next day, they set up video cameras and hydrophones for Bobby and Abel to record their dive. And Siri learns from Mary that Jake will sleep with any willing female. And it's kind of setting up for later. Like, it's very subtly hinting at the fact that something that happens later in the script, which is funny. And it's like, oh, Abel's more interested in fish than he is in people, which is never really plays out, but whatever. And also, she finds out the hard way that Mary never shares chewing gum because she says if she shares it, it'll run out immediately. And the chewing gum is important for later. And so Bobby and Abel dive, and they ascend the side of the pyramid, and they mention that like the lagoon can only be about 40 feet deep. So it's like 60 by 200 feet in terms of area, and the depth is 40 feet. So that kind of gives you an idea of the scale of the lagoon, which I like, because otherwise you're thinking there's all these freaking temples down here. How big is this place? But yeah, if you pay attention to the details, it does figure in how big the thing is, and you can kind of picture it in your head a little bit. It gets a little confusing later, but it's not that big of a deal. And Hector, they're watching, and the others are, they're watching on TV screens aboard the ship, and Hector, who is a native of the Amazon, who left the jungle and went to Harvard, and he works as a botanist up there, and he notes that the hieroglyphs look Incan, and this is one thing I would change, is because I think it would make it a little bit more ambiguous as to what this former civilization that lived under the water was. Like, maybe make it look Incan, but not exactly Incan, because the script never actually commits to any of that. Don't make it like don't have it so that you can easily interpret what the writing says. I think that would be a better change. And also he tells us, because they see an Amazon river dolphin in the lagoon, and Hector tells this story that his people have about how the river dolphins, they can take on human form and seduce women. And he mentions a few myths like that about evolving the water and things that live in the water throughout the script. And the reason why I like that is because it gives you this idea that maybe like the natives have encountered these creatures that, like, now there's only the one living in the lagoon, but way back in the past there were more. Maybe that way back in the past the natives encountered these things and they were the inspiration for all these different tales of like men who live in the water and stuff like that. It's an interesting idea, and that legend is actually real. I looked that up just out of curiosity, and that is a real legend, so did some research, which I thought was cool. And so when Abel and Bobby, then and also Bobby is black, and so I kept picturing Keith David throughout this whole thing, even though he never does any particularly Keith David-y things, because it's Carpenter. I was thinking Keith David. And Jake, I was totally thinking Peter Jason throughout this whole thing, because he could play Jake to the hilt. Everyone else was a tad bit harder to place in terms of Carpenter's ensemble, but still. And so they surface and they reach the top of the pyramid, and Abel decides to just say, oh, screw it, I'm going to go inside anyways. So he follows the passage down. There's a chamber with tons of like stone furniture and an altar, and he grabs a goblet and takes it back to the entrance, and it turns out to be made of solid gold. And the second exploration is set up with Abel, Siri, and Jean-Claude. I was terrible at taking these notes, taking part. And while the group explores the chamber down below, the rest watch from the screens on the boat. And so, like, some of them, they see, like, Jean-Claude, like, goofing around on the boat, goofing around inside this chamber in the pyramid. And I'm guessing he kind of moves away from the camera, but then suddenly, like, the people on the boat, they hear, like, this half of a scream from underwater, and they're like, wait a minute, what happened? So Jean-Claude has disappeared. And so Mary, she shines a light down into the entrance of the pyramid, which is like, she's like blinking the light, which causes a distress signal, which is meant to be a distress signal. And so that gets Abel and Siri to notice that Jean-Claude is missing. And when they go back to the entrance, they find out that he never came back out again. And so Abel goes back in. He tells Siri to stay, but she follows him anyways. And they're watched by the creature, remains unseen by them. And once again, it describes its eyes here. But here it's just like, in the May 8th revision, it says like, oh, we can just barely see what look like eyes in the darkness, which I think is really cool. And so it focuses on watching Siri as she swims by. So this is sort of the start of its fascination with her. And they find an underwater passageway in the chamber, and they follow it to this trapezoid-shaped chamber where the water is only 3 feet deep, and the creature watches them in there as well. Now, I would make this maybe a little bit more than 3 feet deep, maybe closer to 5, because I've been in 3 feet deep water. There ain't no way a fucking man-sized creature is going to hide in the 3 feet deep water and not be noticed. Like, that's the shallow end of a swimming pool. Maybe make it a little bit deeper. But it's watching their legs in the water. And when they don't find Jean-Claude, they exit through the passageway and return to the ship. And the rest of the crew shows them the footage of Jean-Claude from before he disappeared, as well as the audio of the scream. And it's honestly kind of a creepy idea, just that underwater scream. I think that could be a really evocative sort of audio moment in a movie. And so Hector, he calls out to help establish a search party, and his call gets intercepted in Sao Paulo by none other than Pete Hazard, who's alive but scarred and working for the Brazilian government. And he tells them not to enter the water again until he gets there in a day or so. This is one of the major changes in the revisions, is that Pete's dialogue throughout the whole script just gets way more aggressive. And one of the things he says to Hector over the phone in the first draft, all he says is like, don't go in the water until I get there. Or don't go back in the pyramid until I get there, or something like that. And then in the revisions, he's like, let me make it clear to you, if you go back in there, I will rip out your lungs and shove them up your ass. So yeah, he becomes a much more aggressive character. So yeah, this is the reveal that Pete Hazard is alive, and he's got this claw mark down the side of his face. Of course, as we find out, it goes. Now, we never actually find out how he escaped the creature. We find out, how he was, we find out, how he was rescued from the jungle and stuff like that, but we never find out how he got away from the creature, which I would have liked to have heard more of. And so, not wanting to wait, the crew searches the pyramid, and they find a branching passage that leads from the trapezoidal chamber. And Siri, she splits up from the rest, and she swims down the opposite passage. And she finds a large round chamber with like where she can surface, and the ceiling is shaped like a huge pyramid. And she swims along the surface, and this is where we first see the creature. And it does the whole water ballet thing where it's swimming just below her, and it touches her ankle, and when she notices, it flees and hides behind like a rock. And that's when Bobby and Abel show up, telling her it was stupid to wander off, and so they decide to go back. We never find out what was down that other passage. In fact, there was another branching passage in the other passage between the first pyramid and the trapezoidal chamber. So the first pyramid, and then there's a second building which has a trapezoidal chamber, and then there's a third building which is the round chamber. Although I'm a little uncertain as to the third pyramid. I'll talk about that when we get to it. But it's described a little ambiguously to the point where I'm not sure what that third pyramid is supposed to be over. This is a really good scene. I like But yeah, we never find out what's down those other two passages, which are mentioned earlier. So it's like, so do they branch off and not really go anywhere? Like, or do they lead to like the lagoon? And so that's how the creature is getting around without always coming in through the first pyramid's entrance. I guess that's always possible. But yeah, that does so, because like everything else is like set up to like, this goes here, this goes there. It's very well described, this temple complex. But I mean, I'm very curious as to where those other passages led. And the creature in the May 8th revisions, it's described in more detail on page 46. Now I'm going to pull that up and read it because I like how the creature is described. Finally, the dark shape moves out of shadows, and for the first time, we fully see the creature. Half man, half fish, he is huge, powerful. And powerful, come on guys. His body is, I made that part up. His body is plated, covered with scales, yet his skin is almost translucent. Areas of green broken up with mottled colors silvery around his gills. His hands and feet are webbed with huge claws on each digit, and his face, a fish mouth, and inside razor-sharp rows of teeth used to rend and tear flesh. And his eyes, alive, not simply blank fish eyes, but more human, glowing with cunning, emotion, intelligence. He swims after Siri. Pretty evocative description, and you can see how it looks how it still has some of the basic shape of the original creature in there, but with like its own flourishes, like the sharp teeth, which are a little bit more in line with the Monster Squad version of the Gill Man, which amazing movie. Kind of bullshit the Gill Man gets killed with a single shotgun blast, but it's a fun movie. Definitely check that movie out. But I like this description. It's really cool. And I like the description of the eyes glowing with cunning, emotion, intelligence, which is so much better than just soft eyes, which the May 4th draft just hammered in. And yeah, with Rick Baker, who was still attached to do the creature effects, it would have been cool to see how he would have interpreted that and sort of meshed it with the original design, because of course, Rick Baker, his work almost needs no introduction, but looking specifically at the work he did on the Wolfman remake, like you can see where that was inspired by the original Wolfman, but it was very much an updating and a changed, unique version. So it would have been interesting to see how he would have approached the creature from the Black Lagoon. And as far as I know, his creature from the Black Lagoon designs have never surfaced. I know the ADI designs for the mid-2000s version, those have shown up, and I'm not a particular fan of those, but I'd love to know what Rick Baker, would have done with this. Like, I mean, it took forever for his aliens from Night Skies for those designs to finally get released. So hopefully someday down the line, he'll show what his creature from the Black Lagoon would have looked like. So yeah, that's something I would have loved to see. So yeah, that scene's great. And so then we see Pete Hazard. He's heading upriver in a motorboat, and he's talking to himself and shooting randomly at animals, and showing that he's now mentally unstable. This is such a weird thing. Also, in the May 4th draft, he's listening to Fist City, a country song by Loretta Lynn. In the May 8th draft, he's listening to Sympathy for the Devil, and instead the Loretta Lynn song is being listened to by Mary on the boat, so she becomes the country music fan. And so he arrives at the lagoon, and he meets Mary in her lab, and he's just acting like a crazy person, not happy about the team not listening to him, so he'll say something and then talk to himself, and then talk back to himself, and then he tries to steal he takes a stick of her gum and then tries to steal the whole pack, which is pretty funny. And I suppose I should talk about this now. A lot of what goes on with Pete Hazard is very much played humorously. Like, I'm not sure how seriously we're meant to take him, because like he's like shooting at crocodiles on the shore and going like, "Don't fuck with me." Like, I'm not sure if that's meant to be like funny or not. It's almost seems like it's supposed to be funny, but the characters are very much scared of him, very much consider him a threat, and he is in fact dangerous. But it's very weird. Like, tonally, the character's a little weird, and just a little tweaking could have fixed that. And so then we see, we get cut back to the search team. They've met up in the trapezoidal chamber, and Bobby bangs his foot into something, and it turns out to be human bones. And they find the skeleton of Richard from the opening. It's identifiable by the Swiss Army watch, which is still on his wrist. And it's like, okay, that's cool. I mean, that's a pretty cool image. And the watch is mentioned in the intro. And so the search party, they bring the skeleton back to the ship, and they meet, and he's going crazy saying this thing's gonna kill you, and he starts shooting at the pyramid and like lobbing grenades into the water, and he's like opening his shirt, and he shows that the scar continues from his face down his torso, and he's like ranting about how like these Yanomama Indians found him and took him in. He's like, I married 2 of them. They weren't so fond of me bringing whores back though. It's like weird lines like that, which are pretty funny. And in the May 8th revisions, Pete mentions that like he tried to save Richard, and he points at his scar and goes, "This is what it got me." And I'm like, he's still just kind of like, I mean, it still goes the same way as in the May 4th draft, where Richard just gets pulled into the pyramid and then Pete paddles away to the shore. So I'm not really sure, if that makes a whole lot of sense, but I think I can see what Carpenter was maybe trying to do with the past to try and give him a little bit more. It's less about the fact that he got attacked and more about the fact that, like, his friend got killed. I kind of see what he's trying to do. They're trying to give him a little bit more depth of character. And also, so he's going crazy, and the rest of the crew is just like, we all know about this. You can't be throwing explosives into the water. The structure is very old. It's very valuable. It's a rare find. And so Siri gets this idea to pacify him and says, hey, we can put you in charge of the search for Jean-Claude. And he's amenable to that. And they're like, is there any way we can do this without explosives? And they're like, he's like, yeah, well, I think harpoons might do the job. And it's interesting because he never actually says what's down there. He just says, oh, he or it is going to kill you, but I want to kill. It's obvious why they don't believe him, because he's very clearly just a raving madman at this point. This is another scene where, like, they're very clearly afraid of this guy, yet him shooting at the pyramid and lobbing grenades into the water, that just makes him come off as just a little... Yeah, and I'm just not sure if it's supposed to be funny or not. And so Siri, she visits Mary in her lab, who's kind of short with her. And there's this really amusing one where it says, never offer to get anyone coffee because everyone will assume you will start asking you and will never stop. And she meets with Adolfo, who's trying to communicate. He's trying to use the communications technology to get a message out to they're trying to contact the Brazilian government to get rid of Pete Hazard, but it's not working. And there's a story he tells where he's like, you remind me of a girl in Palermo. She's very lonely. And it's him trying to awkwardly hit on her. And it's like, you can tell he's not entirely serious about it. He's just kind of like, might as well try. Adolfo, once again, pretty funny. And so Siri, she meets with Mary again on the deck, who apologizes for earlier behavior, but still won't share her gum. And so then there's a meeting between Adolfo, Abel, Hector, Jake, and Bobby, and he tells them that the circuit boards have been torn out of all three of their communication systems, and they're all like, they all know that it was Pete Hazard who did it. And so Abel is like, he plans to have Mary get rid of Pete's explosives while they're all in the pyramid searching the following morning. And so the next day, while everyone's searching the pyramid, Mary attempts to get the explosives off of Pete's boat, which has been pulled up alongside the El Dorado too. But he somehow has rigged the gun to shoot anybody who tries to come into the room with the explosives. And I'm like, wait a minute. How did he do that? Like, it's a little weird. Like, is he MacGyver? Is it Richard Dean Anderson in The Jungle? Is it MacGyver? Which is kind of funny because for most of this script, I was actually picturing Kurt Russell as Pete Hazard. And I'm like, well, both Kurt Russell and MacGyver played the same character. Kurt Russell in the Stargate movie, MacGyver in the TV show. So kind of a fun coincidence there. And so in the trapezoidal chamber, Bobby finds like a stone door that's leading downwards, and they open it to find a crypt filled with bones, as well as the corpse of Jean-Claude, who's been torn up and his arm has been ripped off, which is a nice gory image. And so they take the corpse back to the ship, and Pete's like, I told you so, and they still don't really believe him, even though it's like, you found your guy torn to pieces, and he was moved behind a door that was closed. It's kind of like, okay, you should maybe listen to him a little bit more. And so there's a nice little bonding moment between Siri and Abel where he tells her that Jean-Claude's death wasn't her fault. And he says, hey, I interned once as a medical doctor in an emergency room, and dying in bed isn't all it's cracked up to be, and it can sometimes be just as awful as what happened here. It was a nice little moment between the characters. And so Jake and Adolfo, they talk about how they need to contact the local authorities about Pete. And so Adolfo sets off in one of their lifeboats to get to the nearest town and contact somebody, but then Pete gets the drop on him and just blows his head clean off and then pushes the boat into the river so it drifts away. So yes, Pete is indeed a very, very sort of, dangerous character, and he is a threat to these people. So yeah, when he's played seriously, he's actually kind of scary. And also, he mentioned earlier that he's been wanting to come back and fight this thing for years. He just never had a specific location for it until now. But earlier, when he was trying to, use the plane radio to get help, he was reading off the coordinates. So I guess he forgot the coordinates or he lost them somehow in the years in between, but whatever. And so that night, Siri, she goes over the last footage of Jean-Claude again, and she focuses on like the area off to the side of him where there's all this space in the background, all this dark space. And so she thinks she sees something, and she goes to ask Mary for a camera, and she finds her in bed with Jake, and she's just kind of like, any port in a storm, which is pretty funny. And so she pauses the footage at the right moment, and like Mary has like a dark room. Siri takes a camera and she takes several photographs of the blank space on the one side. I'm not real clear of what exactly she's doing here because I'm not real familiar with photography, so maybe this is a thing. I've just never heard of it, but she does something to the video footage with the white lines. But she does this series of photos, and eventually this reveals a man-shaped thing behind Jean-Claude right before he disappeared. So it's like, okay, what is this? It's a very strange moment. I'm not sure it completely makes sense. I'm not sure how that works, but it's a nice eerie image of just that silhouette standing there, which is nice build up for the creature. I'm not sure if we need that build up after we've already seen the thing in full, but it's an interesting idea. And so once again, we're exploring the pyramids. It's a little bit like Prometheus, where it's like pyramid, ship, but it's not as repetitive as that movie was. It's not as noticeable here. And so they're exploring the crypt, and they find yet another stone door, and they find a crypt And they find another crypt below it, and there's wall paintings showing fish people, and there's even one showing a man-fish king. So giving you some idea of this underwater society that was here before. And, and they find that the floor is strewn with the bones of fishmen, and so then they find, like, the skeletal hand with the webs between the fingers, which is a shout out to the original movie, where the thing that brought them to the lagoon in the first place was they found that skeletal hand in a rock face downriver from the lagoon, and so they followed that tributary up to the lagoon to find more fossils in the original. But here they find it in the pyramid. But then they find that the stone door is closed and won't budge, and we see the creature piling rocks on top of it, and it's pretty suspenseful where they're running out of oxygen. This is where the two really start to kind of trust each other. Like, this is where their bond sort of starts to strengthen. One of the things I like about it does become a bit of a love story with Abel and Siri, but it's not overplayed, and it feels like it makes total sense for the amount of time we see these two together and their interaction. Like, we're just seeing the very, very start of this relationship, which works pretty well. And I'm also not too sure if this doesn't interfere maybe with the creature's whole crush on this girl, that he's just piling the rocks on top and hoping she drowns or suffocates. Like, it's a little, like, it shows the ingenuity of the creature, so it's a good thing, but also I'm not sure it makes sense with what they're doing with the creature. It's a little bit inconsistent. It's not a huge deal. But the creature flees when the rest of the group shows up, and they move the rocks away, and so Abel and Siri get out, and they take the bones back to the ship, and the creature's watching from underwater, and it sees the two of them acting kind of close, and it sees Abel put his arm around her, and so it's not happy about that. And so they talk about how they need to get archaeologists and anthropologists to study the find, but Pete just wants to kill the creature, and the rest still don't believe in it fully, and still don't fully believe in it for whatever reason. It does seem like it takes them a while to clock onto the idea that this guy maybe has a point. And so then we get a scene where Pete, Abel, and Hector, they go up in the expedition's helicopter, and they trace out the shape of the temple complex from above, and they say there's 3 buildings, maybe more, and there's a pyramid in the water. They figure out roughly where the trapezoidal chamber and the round chamber would be, and then they point at the remains of a pyramid, which they can just about see in the underbrush on the shore. It's like covered in trees and vines, and it's partly, surrounded by dirt, so it's a little bit hidden. And so we get this, and so that's interesting. And then they return to the ship, and they find out from Mary the rest of the crew has gone diving again. And we see Siri, Jake, and Bobby enter the round chamber from earlier, and they find a stone door on the opposite side that leads to a large underground lake, and the creature is in there with them. And we see it swim to an island in the lake. It crawls out of the water, and water spills from pockets on its arms and legs as it does, and it also changes color. And so that's an interesting idea. It has almost like natural ballast tanks, sort of the way a submarine works. So when it's in water, they fill up so it can stay underwater. But when it comes out on land, they empty so it can walk around on land. Its movements are described as kind of reptilian-ish. And also, it's also in the revisions. It has these filmy lenses that allow it to see underwater when it's on land. And so it crawls on an island, and then. And in the May 4th draft, it's mentioned that when its lungs fill, its gills close, its lungs open, that makes a Darth Vader sound, which is kind of silly reading that. But in the May 8th draft, that bit's cut out. It just says it makes a breathing noise. And they hear it, and there's there's breathing in here. And so Pete, Abel, and Hector, they all turn up about this point, and they decide to spread out across the lake and just move across looking for the creature. And when it gets alarmed, it starts leaking ink and the claws extend. It's the idea it has these instinctive sort of ideas. Now these once again are additions to the design of the creature, and they do seem like if done the wrong way, they might not work. With Rick Baker doing the designs, I think you could find a way to work it in and make them look good with something that's kind of like the original design but different. So I have faith Rick Baker could have pulled it off. But so they move across the lake, and they get to the island, and it manages to hide from them under some rocks, but it emerges to kind of look at some of their scuba equipment that they put down. But then Bobby turns around and comes face to face with it and gets clawed to death. And so Pete chases after it and loses it in a tunnel that's filled with these funeral biers that are bearing the skeletons of dead fish people. So you get so once again, you're getting even more of an idea of this whole lost society that used to exist, and that the creature is the final descendant of these things, the last son of the Black Lagoon, so to speak. So yeah, more good ideas. And so they find that the pyramid tip on land has an entrance that leads directly to the lake. Now this is where I'm confused about the layout of the complex, because the round chamber is described as having a big pyramid-like ceiling. So I thought that was the third pyramid, but at the base of the pyramid that's on land, that entrance leads directly to the lake. So what the hell? once again, it's a little bit confusing the way it's described. And while they're examining this door, Hector looks at some vines and some bark, and he uses his sort of knowledge from his native people to say, hey, we can mix this stuff together and make like a knockout drug that we can put in the water. Natives sometimes use it for fishing, and we can get the creature that way. And what's actually really interesting, there's a moment where I think it's Jake who says, hey, what if it's off on the other side of the pyramid? And they say, hey, it looks more like it would live here or something like that. And they say, hey, it's a fish. It's not going to know. But then, of course, it senses that this stuff is in the water and then swims off to the other end of the complex, which I thought was a pretty cool idea. And so they use these native fishing methods to knock the creature out, and they subdue and capture it. And the plan goes pretty well, and Pete's about to shoot it and kill it, and Hector stops him. And they're all like, we have to study it. And Pete has one of the best lines in the script where he says, you can study it in a jar and no one will get killed, which is pretty funny. It was pretty hysterical, if I'm being honest. I thought that was a great line. But so they bring it back to the ship, and it's kept in Mary's lab where there's all these different animals that are kept in cages, including a jaguar. And I'm like, you really want to keep that on a confined boat? Whatever. So they put it in a cage, which is somehow partially filled with water, even though it's a cage. So there's spaces where the water can leak out. But what do I know? I'm a bear. I suck the heads off fish. But it's in Mary's lab with all the other specimens, and Siri and Abel come to observe the creature, and she shows a level of empathy towards it, and we see it examining its reflection in this full-length mirror that Mary keeps in the room, and it shows a certain level of intelligence and understanding. And there's all this talk of, it could be porpoise smart, or it could be as smart as a man. And I'm like, why are you caging it? And then the creature begins to freak out and act aggressively, just straining the bars, and even damages some of them because it sees Abel and Siri acting somewhat affectionately towards one another. And so Hector tries to inject it with more of the knockout concoctions, but he drops like one of the hypodermic needles and it breaks, and then the creature breaks another one. And so he just dips a harpoon in the stuff and then shoots it. And so the crew is like, we want to leave right now, but then Mary's like, she wants a few hours to finish the test, so they decide to leave in 3 hours instead. And so they send Siri to inform Pete of the decision, but he's acting like a crazy person again. And he's insisting they make a big mistake. And he's like, hey, you want to stay on my boat? And she's like, no, which was pretty funny. And he's like showing off his scar, going like, I can't feel anything here. Like, if this was acted and directed right, like the character could be really interesting and kind of intimidating, yet kind of pathetic and sad. Like, he could be really interestingly played. I just think on the page he comes off a little. And so here comes like a moment where we see just how smart the creature is that it pretends to be knocked out while Mary is busy counting her algae. And so it snags a broom from the cage and it moves Mary's pack of gum right to the edge of the desk and closer to the cage, where it's just barely hanging onto the edge. And so when she moves, it falls. It's a slice move from Mary, knocks it to the floor, and it lands right near the cage, and so she bends down to get it, and the creature swipes at her throat, and it just starts blood spraying everywhere, then pulls her head into the bars and crushes her skull, and it breaks out of the cage where the bars had already been damaged, and smashes up the room, releasing all the animals, gets into the dark room, knocks all these chemicals over, and starts a fire. Hector tries to subdue it, but misses his shot with the harpoon gun, and the creature gets away. Oh yeah, before that, it was tossing all the items in the room out into the water, including the full-length mirror, which will be important later. But when the creature gets away, it dives into the water right in front of Pete, and Pete is just paralyzed and can't do anything. Like, that's actually a pretty good moment for that character. And so Abel and Jake, they were off retrieving ropes from the third pyramid's land entrance when they were there so they could gather all their items together before they leave. They arrived to find the boat in chaos. Abel and Siri put out the fire. Then we see Pete, Hector, and Jake patrolling the third pyramid with the helicopter, not seeing any sign of the creature. And on the boat, Abel and Siri, they have another moment and they kiss, and the creature bursts in, drags her off, swims away with her, and climbs into the pyramid, almost getting shot by Pete, who hits the pyramid instead. And so the men, they follow in pursuit, making their way to the underground lake just behind the creature, who has, it actually brings up the idea that she needs to breathe underwater, and so the creature actually like blows air into her mouth, and so it's this weird kind of like kissing scene almost, and she almost like, it's a moment where she almost kind of stops being afraid of it for a moment, which is kind of neat. And it shows that it's not just treating her like an object, like it does have some kind of caring attitude towards her, which is interesting. And so they reach a grotto on the other side of the lake just before the crew does. So it's like a big cave area, which also, once again, is calling back to the original movie where it kidnaps her and takes her to this cave, which is where it lives in the original movie. So it's kind of like that, only we added the whole pyramid thing. And so the team is forced to split into pairs when they find a three-way fork in the cave. Abel and Hector go to the left while Jake and Pete take the center. Jake and Pete find the waterfall, and Pete sees the creature's tracks going off in a different direction, so he goes off there. Jake doesn't hear him mention this, and so he goes through the waterfall and he finds Siri laying on a rock. But the creature emerges and like Jake manages to shoot it with 2 harpoons in his midsection, but the creature just swats his head right off. And then the creature just grabs Siri, carries her further off into the cave. Then Abel and Hector, they return to the fork and then split up, with Abel going right and Hector taking the center. And then Hector gets attacked by the creature, who crushes his back and face, killing him. Like, it tries to shoot him before he dies, but he misses. Then Abel and Pete, who they've crossed paths on top of the waterfall, they hear the commotion with Hector, and so they head back down, and they rush down there and they find the bodies, and so they follow a stream further into the cave, finding a 2-way fork. Hold on, I lost my notes. They find a 2-way fork, they split up, and Pete sees the creature directly ahead of him pulling one of the harpoons out. And Pete fires his rifle, but glass shatters, and so it turns out that the creature set up a mirror at the end of the tunnel to trick Pete with a reflection. It comes up right beside him and then smashes his head down into his torso and then dumps the body in the pool and lets the piranhas eat it. And I'm like, ooh, that's crazy. I like seeing the creature be pretty clever and turn the tables on the hunter. That was a pretty neat scene and shows how smart the creature actually is. And so Abel followed his side of the passage. He finds Siri laid out on a rock, about to be crushed by a giant anaconda, which I swear comes completely out of nowhere. It's a little silly. So Abel fires his harpoon gun and pistol into the snake and starts cutting it with his diving knife. The creature arrives and is like, he's watching them fight, and he's like, I'm actually kind of impressed by this Abel guy, and then just shoves him aside and slams him right into the cave wall, knocking them out. Then the creature fights the anaconda and just tears it to pieces like that. I'm like, okay, it's a little bit silly, but the creature fighting an anaconda is a pretty cool idea. And so it goes to Siri and it sees how terrified she is, and it's watching her, and she's kind of looking at its eyes, and she calms down a bit as she stops crying for a moment, and she goes to remove one of the harpoons that's still stuck in its midsection. And so there's this nice sort of peaceful moment between the two, and then the creature reaches out to touch her, but then notices that its claws will hurt her. And there's a moment where it's thinking, because it still has its thing for her, but then it starts to realize that there's sort of that they're from different worlds, and it starts regretting. It's all done really, really quickly and no dialogue because the creature can't talk. And once again, it would be cool to see if Rick Baker could have pulled that level of emotion out of the creature from the Black Lagoon in terms of the makeup and creature design. But it's an interesting idea. And I remember when I first read this, I wasn't quite so sure of this because the creature, considers for a moment, realizes this isn't going to work. And even though she's not afraid of it anymore and she's not crying or anything, it realizes that, this isn't going to work, that they're too different. They're from two different worlds. And so it just walks off into the water and swims away and lets her go. And I remember thinking that seems like kind of an iffy ending considering all it went to, kidnapping her and all that. But reading it again and looking at the subtleties there, I like it. It gives the creature a little bit more personality and a little bit more humanity. I think it's a nice idea for an ending. And so Siri, she goes to Abel and sort of wakes him up, and she goes to kiss him. He's like, man, I am not in the mood right now, which is a funny line. And so they leave together and they go to cross the underground lake, and the last shot is the creature sticking its head out from the water and watching them as they leave, which is kind of a nice bittersweet sort of moment. Now, this script has a few flaws. I'd say Siri showing up out of nowhere, no setup for how she gets on the boat, is a little awkward. Pete Hazard's character, while the idea of this guy who was attacked by the creature and wants to get even with it is a good idea, and the idea of him just being completely bugfuck crazy is good, maybe tone down some of the humorous stuff with him and make him just a little bit darker, a little bit more threatening would be a good idea. And with a little bit, and honestly, that's something you could just fix in production. You don't even need to rewrite the script to fix that. You just have the actor play it a little bit differently. And that's it. But yeah, overall, I can say this is a very strong, reverent, but still original remake of The Creature from the Black Lagoon. And I think if this had been worked on a little bit more and had actually been made, it would have been it might have actually helped Carpenter's career in the 90s, and it would have been one of the better horror remakes, honestly. I don't know if this would have been as good as The Thing or The Fly, but I think I could mention it in the same breath as, say, Cat People or The Blob. I think it's up there with The Blob. The Blob's a really good remake. This would have been up there, too. I put The Blob slightly lower than... I don't think it's as near perfect as The Thing or The Fly is, but The Blob is still a very good, entertaining update of a 50s movie, and I think this is on that level. And I think... Cat People's weird, because even though that's an update of an older horror movie, that's very much off on its own sort of... it's not so much on a higher level as is just off to the side as like its own weird thing, because Paul Schrader just made a very strange, different movie there. But I'd say this would have been a good sort of, horror remake from that period. Now, the reason why this didn't happen, and I'm a little fuzzy as to why it took from 1992 to 1995. I guess Carpenter was busy, because I know Carpenter went and did Body Bags and In the Mouth of Madness. But basically what happens is that Universal eventually told him, the executive said, if we'll let you do Creature from the Black Lagoon, but first you have to do this Village of the Damned remake we've been trying to get off the ground for a while. And so Carpenter did it, and he went and made that movie, but by the time he was finished making it and it got released, not only did the film not do very well, which didn't help his case at all, but there was a changeover in executives at Universal, and so the Creature from the Black Lagoon movie just kind of went away for that period. And it's a shame, because I think if they would have let Carpenter work with this script and really refine it and like direct the hell out of it and give it a great Carpenter score, maybe with a few touches from the original score thrown in, it could have been a really damn good movie, I think, just given a bit of work. So yeah, that's a shame. And it's also a shame because Village of the Damned is such a standard, bland remake. I mean, when you look at Carpenter remakes, like The Thing is just really, really great. Like that just took the ideas of Campbell's original novella and some of, the Howard Hawksian kind of style from The Thing from Another World and just kind of amped it up and took it to a whole other level and just made just a great movie out of it. Whereas Village of the Damned is just the original movie just in the 90s and in America with some changes. It's not even particularly gory as a remake, which you would think a Carpenter remake would be. Like, it would be more violent, but it really isn't that much more. It's just a couple of charred corpses you see. Like, even the scene where a character turns a gun on himself and blows his own brains out, like, even that's exactly the same. Like, it's such a tame remake. I mean, you'd think it would have gone crazy with the whole, what were the parents of the evil children or whatnot, but it really doesn't. So it's disappointing on that level, but it's not the worst Carpenter film I've ever seen. It's just not great, and it's what I could do without. So yeah, Creature from the Black Lagoon, after the Carpenter thing all fell apart, like Universal, I think they offered it to Peter Jackson, but he said he turned it down so he could do the King Kong remake instead, which he started working on, and then that fell apart because of Mighty Joe Young, and so he went and did, he didn't do his King Kong remake until later. And apparently, I don't know what the source is for this. I've just read this in one place, but it's so silly I have to bring it up. Apparently, John Landis got involved again, and supposedly they're going to redo it as an urban comedy. Take that with a grain of salt. That's fucking hilarious, isn't it? Like, the rapper from the Black Lagoon, R. Kelly from the Black Lagoon, he's gonna piss on the girl. The creature singing piss on you, and it's fucking guttural. That would have been kind of silly. And then they kept trying a Creature from the Black Lagoon remake throughout the early to mid 2000s where like Gary Ross got the right, like Guillermo del Toro was going to do it and he wanted to make it a Victorian period piece, but like Universal balked at some of his ideas. And then like Gary Ross was going to produce it and he wrote some drafts, and those drafts get covered later on and they're terrible. And like it was very close to getting made by Brecca Eisner in 2007, 2008, and would have been out for a 2009 release. But then the writer's strike happened, so they couldn't rewrite the script when they wanted to, and then all sorts of things happened, and so it got put on the back burner. But they kept like commissioning new versions. Like I think it was David Kajanik was the last writer, and we covered a script of his last year with It. He was commissioned to do a version, and they keep talking. Like Jeff Pinkner was brought up as one of the writers who he did Amazing Spider-Man 2, and he wrote a draft of Dark Tower, which was basically the movie, only a lot better. And like Creature from the Black Lagoon was nebulously, they sort of folded into development that had been going on for years, just kind of folded it into the whole Dark Universe thing, which probably isn't even happening anymore. So who knows now? But that's pretty much the history of the project. I'll talk about those other drafts at a later date when I have someone else to help me through that boring shit. But yeah, Creature from the Black Lagoon, the Bill Phillips, John Carpenter version, this would have been a really solid Creature from the Black Lagoon movie. It would have been a very good remake, and I think this one, it's a shame it didn't happen in some form. Until whatever episode comes next, guys, remember, check out the Facebook, Tumblr, Twitter, Blogger pages, and check out the Shelved podcast. Yes, they haven't done episodes in a while, but there's plenty of back episodes you can listen to. And until next time, guys, bye.